Come with me, Jake Turner, as I travel the back roads talking with corn and soybean experts about best practices in pest control, ag issues, and how growers can get more from every acre. All you need is a minute. I'm headed to the University of Arkansas to talk with Travis Foskey, Extension plant pathologist, about how to control diseases specific to southern soybeans that can decrease yield. As you know, predicting what issues you're going to have in your soybeans is about as difficult as predicting the weather. Hey, Travis.
Hey, Jake, how you doing?
Doing good. Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about plant disease today.
Excellent.
What kind of plant disease issues are you having here in Arkansas?
We have quite a range of plant pathogens, from plant parasitic nematodes like root knot nematode and soybean cyst nematode, which infect the root systems of soybean plants, to things like soil-borne fungal diseases, stem canker, sudden death syndrome, charcoal rot, to foliar diseases from brown spot, anthracnose, pod and stem blight, and frog eye leaf spot.
And what diseases particularly affect soybeans?
Every year somewhere in the state we have foliar disease issues with anthracnose, pod and stem blight, and frog eye leaf spot.
How do you correctly identify which pathogen is causing your issue?
Well, the first thing I look at is definitely the foliar symptoms. It's dramatic. But the next thing I look at is look down at the base of the stem. If I see a lesion there down at the base, it's actually stem canker. And if there are leaves that are dropped off and the petioles are actually exposed, then it probably is sudden death syndrome. The last thing I'd look at the stem and confirm that it's a white pith tissue and a BSDS. So those look really close. For the foliar diseases, sometimes it's a little easier. Sometimes we can actually see the spores actually on the lesions themselves. And we can see some of those here. This is actually frog eye leaf spot. You can recognize it by this brown to maroon colored margin. And then we have the brown center. But the spores here are actually the little white spots here, not the dark ones, but the white ones. And we can actually see that that is actually the fungus itself.
So you plant pathologists do a lot of detective work.
We ask a lot of questions. What has happened in this field in the past? What is the susceptibility of our host? And if not, we may have to come back into the lab and look at it underneath the microscope.
What different weather patterns or conditions can increase the risk for plant diseases?
The more water we have, the more potential for foliar disease issues we'll have.
What growth stages should growers be out scouting for these issues?
Usually when we go into the reproductive stages is when we're looking for diseases, because that tends to be the time that those have the greatest impact on reducing or limiting that yield potential of that plant. When that canopy covers the row, that microclimate becomes a factor for disease development.
And then what treatment window do they have?
If they're scouting at that time and they find disease, they probably need to think about treating depending on the host susceptibility, if that disease is a yield-limiting disease like frog eye leaf spot, and what the environmental conditions are that we have coming up in the next couple of weeks. That timing should be somewhere about that R2 to R4 stage tend to be when we have the biggest bang for our buck when we're using a treatment like a fungicide.
At what point should a grower say, yep, I'm going to have to institute a management program?
If they do see frog eye and they have a susceptible host and the conditions are favorable for disease, they're going to have to treat sooner than later to protect that yield potential and keep that disease from spreading through the field.
Now, if they don't institute a management program, you've got some images to show us about what that looks like in progression, right?
So every time you have a pathogen infecting a plant, there's something called the latent period, the quiet period, where you do not see any symptoms. On this image, we have different maturity stages of the frog eye leaf spot lesion. So here's one that's very mature and it's definitely sporulating. These others are less mature. You can see that water-soaked lesion around the edge. They'll be sporulating in a couple of days. And then here we can see some that are just the faint hue of discoloration, and that infection has already taken place, and then those will be sporulating in 7 to 10 days. And there's where we had an example of the multiple infections you can have at a time and how quickly that frog eye leaf spot can actually develop on a susceptible cultivar.
So you mentioned resistance before. Have you had any issues with resistance in soybeans?
We actually identified the strains frog eye leaf spot that were resistant to the strobilurin fungicides in 2012. Since then, my crew and I have been out. We've been collecting samples from different counties, and we're up to 27 counties now that have been confirmed to have a isolate, at least that has resistant to the strobilurin fungicides.
Now, in your research trials, have you seen an impact in acres that have been treated with the fungicide?
My plots are traditionally small plots, but it gives you an idea what would happen on a large scale. And so using a susceptible soybean cultivar, and we've had frog eye. In this particular field, we have the strobilurin resistant frog eye leaf spot. So when we apply a fungicide that's effective to control those strains compared to one that's non-effective or non-treated control, we can see anywhere from a 12 to 15% yield difference between those.
And what attributes are you looking for an effective fungicide?
The things that I like to see in a fungicide first is efficacy, that it's able to control the target pathogen. And as we mentioned with resistance, you want to have a fungicide that's actually be able to do that. The second would be systemic, something that's actually going to move through that canopy when we're treating soybeans that may be neck tall. You want to be able to get that to be translocated through the upper canopy. And finally, from a management standpoint, I really like to see something that would have two modes of action because oftentimes there's other pathogens out in the field that may be problematic, and something like the strobilurins are still effective on those. So those are the things that I would like to see.
What advice would you give growers who are considering using a foliar fungicide?
I'd give a couple of pieces of advice. The first would be don't wait too long. As you see disease develop in your field and you have a susceptible host, you definitely want to treat earlier than later to minimize that development, as we saw in that image before. The other thing would be able to use a fungicide that has two modes of action. Most of the times we have a triazole combined with a strobilurin. The triazoles are effective on the strobilurin resistant frog eye leaf spot. But the strobies do work well on a lot of our other fungal diseases that we do have in the field, so I often recommend those two.
And then, of course, if they're not sure what issue they have, they should reach out to their plant pathologist, right?
That's why we're here, and that's why we enjoy doing what we're doing.
Thanks so much.
Thanks. Enjoyed it.
Travis taught us a lot today about how to manage diseases in southern soybeans. Management options like cultural practices utilizing host plant resistance is good. So is applying Top Guard fungicide or preemptor fungicide. See your FMC retailer or consultant. So until next time, keep an eye on the weather and take preventive measures to protect your crop. I'll see you down the road when you have a minute.